Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live. My name is Michaela Westra and I'm going to be your host tonight. Now before we get started, let's make sure we go over that class code. That is going to be JL349. And if you put that class code in JerrysArtarama.com, it will show you everything that we're using tonight. And tonight we are going to be talking about palette knife painting. And the fun thing about this is I have our normal palette knives that we all know and love. I also have our very fun FX palette knives. Now these all come in so many different shapes and sizes that before we jump in and create a nice full painting, I want to show you what all of these do. Now I've already brought out my paints and everything, but I wanted to show you the difference between a normal palette knife and an FX palette knife. So I have two of the same painting here, and one was done with normal palette knives and one was done with the FX palette knives. Now if we go to the overhead, we can see the difference. Right now they look very similar. I have a different color background, but the texture is going to be the biggest difference. With the normal palette knife, I was able to do very small blocks of color right next to each other, and with the FX palette knives, I was able to get a lot more texture, especially down here in my reference photo. There are a lot of veins and detail down here that I was actually able to capture with the palette knife that I was not able to capture with the normal palette knives. I was able to use the FX palette knives to create that veiny texture. And my amazing moderators, Amanda and Emmy, will be able to show those reference photos if you would like to see them. But I wanted to show the difference between the normal and the FX because you can use all FX, you can use all normal palette knives, but I want to show what you can get when you combine them, using the perfect palette knife for the perfect area in your painting. So before we jump into doing the actual painting, I do want to show you what texture each of these can create. So for these FX palette knives, it comes in a set of 9, and each one is very different. Now these first three, 1 through 3, have very unique shape that you can use the front end of the palette knife for that texture. From 4 through 9, both sides of the palette knife have a different look. So like this one, for example, this is the number 6. One side is nice and flat, like our usual palette knives that we can use, and the other side has this really nice curvy edge. So both sides can do something different. Same with these. This has both sides with curves. One has a smaller curve, the other has a larger curve. So every palette knife from 4 through 9 is going to have a different texture on both sides. Now let's go ahead and see what these look like. I have some paint out. I'm just going to grab some random colors so we can show you what they look like. This is going to be the FX palette knife number 1. And I love this one because it creates this really nice streaky pattern. It has a very rough edge. You can create those really fine lines. This is what I use to create those veins in the bottom portion of my flower here. Now, while I'm switching between palette knives, I might as well show you, these are so easy to clean. If you haven't used palette knives before, you just wipe them off on a rag and you're all set to go. You don't have to worry about cleaning brushes. These are so much easier to clean. But let's go on to number 2. This is also one of my favorites. It has a very flat edge, but all of these lines in here is a cut in the palette knife. So you can create kind of very similar to the number 1 palette knife, but that paint is going to squeeze through those lines and create a very nice subtle texture in one go. So again, I'm just going to use my Easy Wiper rags. This is the palette knife that I would recommend keeping a close eye on when you're cleaning it. Because those grooves are so tiny, if you're using acrylic paint like I am, that can dry in the crevices. I would make sure that when you're done working, this is the one that gets a little extra clean. Now this one is the number 3, and this is my favorite just because it has a couple different uses. I did use this one for creating these repetitive little dots on the stamen of my flower. That took literally 2 seconds to add to my painting, where this one, I had to add each one of those little dots one by one. So let's go ahead, pick a different color. So you can stamp on these tiny little spots. You can draw this down and create separated lines. Another thing that I love about this is you can use this as a stamp. You can use all of them as a stamp, but I think this one is the most fun. You can create a repetitive pattern by pressing this into the panel and creating a nice, almost a wallpaper effect where you can create a repeating pattern all the way through your painting if you wanted to. Now those first 3 are my favorite because they're probably the most unique. These ones are also so much fun. So I'm going to show you one side. I'm going to start with the smallest, and then on my second one I'll go to the biggest and just show a little bit of the variation because they are very similar. So let's go for a green. Maybe I'll grab 2 greens here. I'm just going to streak this down so you can see what one stroke looks like. But you can also, just like the number 3, stamp on these really unique shapes. This would be fun for trees in the background if you have a lot of foliage. You can get really creative with these palette knives. Alright, number 5, very similar. I'm going to go for the larger bumps. And I am using acrylic paint for this, and I wanted to use acrylic paint because it dries faster and I can layer a lot faster on live when I have paint that dries faster than oil, for example. I'm going on to the number 6. I really like this one because if I need that really large flat edge and I'm only using my FX knives, I still have that in my arsenal. So I'll go for another color. Again, you can just use it like any other palette knife, that flat edge, and then you can also go in and add lines to it if you want. These are so much fun. Alright, while I'm going, do we have any questions already? Awesome. Okay, so 7, 8, and 9, the last 3 in the set, are very funky looking. They have little grooves in the knife that do the same thing as this one here, number 2, with those lines cut in the knife, but they are a lot more spaced out. And again, it's going to create something similar to the curvy lines as well, but this is going to be more organic, while these chunky ones are going to create more of a thick, solid line. So if you wanted to, you could paint your panel all one color, and if you wanted stripes going through, you could really just use your palette knife to create those lines streaking through. I always like stamping it on there too. Alright. And these ones are also a little bit more careful with cleaning because it is going to be harder to just swipe along the edge. It's going to get caught in these, so I like to kind of pinch it and pull out if I really want to clean it super well. And these all just vary in size. So you can create different lines if you want to create evenly spaced dots or marks in your painting. Knowing how these work is really going to help you create that perfect brush stroke, because I really think when you're working with palette knives, you're able to lay down that one perfect stroke, and these are going to give you some really nice variation when you're laying down that one stroke. It's going to give you texture right off the bat. What haven't I done yet? I think I've used them all. Let's create something new, like a gradient. And this one is just a little bit smaller than these first two. But again, you're able to get really nice texture with just one stroke. Now, I wanted to create a painting using only palette knives, but being able to use these special palette knives to get those perfect marks. So I'm going to use both these FX knives and our normal set of palette knives. Now, in this set, there are 8 knives, and most of them are trowels. And when I say trowel, I mean these guys. So it's going to have either a diamond shape or a smooth kind of teardrop shape. That's going to be your trowel. And I also have a couple scrapers, and that's what this S is going to stand for on the handle here. The T is going to stand for that trowel, and the S is going to stand for the scraper. I love these scrapers for when you're covering the whole panel in one color and you want a very smooth, solid surface. Using these is going to help with that. And they have multiple edges that you can use. You can use this huge flat edge here. You can use this tiny edge, this larger edge. You can really use this at any angle. And I love this set because we also have a couple oval trowels. And these are so much fun for stamping or pulling out petals, whatever you need. These are really nice organic shapes that you can use for that. But I'm going to be using a combination of these guys and these guys to create something new. So let me move some things out of the way. I wanted to use the same size panel, and I prepped this the same way that I did for these flowers. I prepped it with just Turner acrylic gouache. And I love having this underneath acrylic because it's nice and matte. It's not going to pick up, and it's going to contrast the glossiness of that acrylic. So I just did a really quick, colorful background for my reference photo here. And I probably won't use all of these, so I'm going to try and take some out that I know I probably will not use. I do know I like these for creating this texture in the door. There are a couple lines spacing out the wood panels in the door. I really like that, so I need to find the right size. Maybe I'll use this to help me. I think I'm going to go for this one here to get those lines, and maybe I'll use this one. So I'll have both of these out, and I'll put this guy away, just making more space. I know I want to use this guy for my greenery because it's going to make adding those tiny little spots of leaves so much easier and faster. And I love this guy so much, I can't even tell you why, so he has to be out as well. And I don't really have really fine texture in my image, so I probably won't use this. I'm going to put it off to the side. If I absolutely need it, I have it. And then I think I'm not going to use this guy. because it has that flat edge, and that's what I'm always drawn to. And I have these other palette knives that have that nice flat edge. And I probably won't use that big of a curvy texture. So I'll keep, I like this medium-sized one, so I'll hold on to that one. And I have these off to the side in case I change my mind. I just want to keep a little bit more space available so you guys can see everything I'm doing. All right. Now, I do want to make sure that I'm working from the background to the foreground, especially with palette knives, because I'm going to be layering. And if I'm trying to do this door around my flowers, it's going to be so much harder to get a nice smooth transition in the door. So I'm going to do the whole door, and then I'll add the flowers on top of it once I have that really nice smooth transition on there. So let's go ahead. I think I'm going to do the door like a deeper blue and then have white spots where that highlight is coming in. So maybe I'll just start with this blue that I already have here and get some of that texture on there. Now I'm trying not to be too precious with what I'm putting on there because I can always move it around or paint over it. I just want to lay something on there and I can always work around it. And another thing with palette knives is you work with a lot of paint. So making sure you have a lot of paint on your palette knife is really going to make it move a lot farther and create that texture you're looking for. I am using the Lucas Krill Pastos acrylic, and that's really going to hold up to the texture I add. Anything that comes off the surface is going to dry in that state. Now that I have these kind of rough lines on here, I do know that they are evenly spaced. So I have colors evenly spaced. I can now go in with another palette knife. I like this one because it's got a nice long flat edge. I can go in and fill in between, already knowing that it's evenly spaced out. So let me get a slightly different color and mix it up on my palette. You have a question?
Yes, Georgia on YouTube was wondering, what is the best solution for cleaning your palette knives?
I like to clean them while they're still wet and they're not dried, especially when I'm using acrylic, and just wipe them off with a rag. As soon as I'm done using it, I wipe it off with a rag, put it down, and grab another palette knife. If you let it dry on there, you can just soak them in water and then peel the acrylic off afterwards. If you're using oil, again, wiping it off before you leave your painting session for the day so it doesn't dry on there. But again, you can use alcohol to clean it off the palette knife. But being diligent on cleaning them as soon as you're done using them is really going to keep them lasting a really long time. Now, making sure you load up the right edge. I like using this side, this edge, when I'm filling in over here. So I want to make sure I'm loading it up at that angle so I can fill in that edge and just drag in between there. And I had a little bit too much on there, so I'm just going to take it off, scrape it. And now I'm going up to this top edge. It's going to be a lot easier to use the opposite angle, so I'm going to load it up at the opposite angle. Palette knives are so nice for creating those crisp edges in your paintings. I did get a little bit of green in some of my paint, but I'll go back over it with a cleaner color. And while you're working, if you know you are adding a lot of layers, like this is going to be my base layer and I know I'm adding flowers on top of this, you should be careful with how you are adding the texture. If you want to have a nice flower on top of this and this has already created a nice little mountain of paint, I would be more careful with creating a flatter texture, or making sure before this dries, carving out a little space for my flower. And I did use a brush for the background. I usually like to say that if you are working with just palette knives, there's always going to be a place for a brush. And it's usually going to be for covering the background, so that when you add all of this paint on here, anything that's showing through those blocks of paint is going to have a purposeful color. And another thing when you're working with painting with palette knives, it's very rare that you're going to get something super, super realistic. With palette knives, you're going to get color and texture. So if you are working with palette knives, you're someone that likes putting things directly on the canvas and creating really nice texture. These are also great for our realistic painters. Maybe not for the whole painting, but for adding those little spots of detail or some different texture to separate from your realism. Maybe you want something to kind of contrast that, creating something more abstract. I always like to push myself though when it comes to using something that's not a realistic medium or typically used as a realistic medium, and kind of pushing myself to make it as realistic as possible. So I definitely find palette knives fun. I'm definitely trying to push this into a realistic looking painting, of course allowing for some abstraction to poke through. I'm trying not to cover up my dark details, but I think I'm just going to cover them up. So before I put this down, I always like to clean it so I don't have to worry about wiping off dry paint when I use it again. But now that I have that on there, I want to make sure I get those details in the door back in there. And I really like this guy for those tiny round details. Now, I did not give myself black, but let's go ahead and mix a really dark color. I believe this is my green umber and my madder lake. They're opposite colors on the color wheel. Hoping I get a nice brown. There we go. Now, this little detail on the door is not really seen anymore. I did draw it in, but I'm going to put in as much as possible, even though I'm covering it up. create little whirly-doos. The idea of a whirly-doo. Now, I'm not a fan of the brown next to that black, so I am going to cover up all that black I see. With more of this brown. And I'm not going to use this curved palette knife for the edges because I have perfectly straight edges on one of my other palette knives. Trying not to get married to these beautiful palette knives. Let's see. I've used this one, I should probably clean it. I think I'll go back to one of my big trowels. Just for those edges. Nice crisp edges. You can always go back in with the other side of your palette knife to crisp up the other side. And I'm really just pressing that edge into the panel and pulling the paint so I keep that nice sharp edge that I'm laying down. And while I'm laying this down, I'm kind of thinking about how I'm going to lay down my greenery. It is in front of a nice tan brick wall. So I think I'm just going to lay down some of that color in the background and then jump straight into the greenery. Now, as I'm going, I'm laying down my big chunks of color first. Once I have the entire canvas filled with paint, the color that I want, or close to the color that I want, I can then go in with my smaller detail palette knives like this, or like this, and add in those tiny textures and spots of color once everything has kind of been blocked in. So let's go in with my scraper and mix up a nice tan color for my greenery to sit on top of. And I really like this yellowish green. I'll mix it with the orange and the yellow, maybe a little bit of that Madder Lake. And a fun thing about this that you can't get with brushes is you can get a really nice marbling effect with your palette knives. I mix it a little bit too much for that, but you can mix it just barely, or you can lay out 3 or 4 colors in a line, scoop it up with your palette knife and create a really nice gradient or a really nice marbling effect. Now, I probably will get a little bit of it, but we'll see. And I'm letting this run across the surface. Ooh, I got the table. And I kind of want to do everything in the same direction so that any marbling I get from these strokes are all going in the same direction. Now in order to get that nice crisp line, I'm going to flip it upside down so I can get to that same angle with my wrist. I'm just pressing it against where I want that crisp line and pulling up. I do like that blue and magenta peeking through. And I flip it again this way. Again, get those nice crispy corners. And since I want to maintain the directional lines, I'm just going to crisp up those edges, bring it back this way, and smooth it all back down so it goes in the same direction again. Gonna do the same thing on the other side here. Get those crisp lines, pressing it down and pulling right where that line is. And the fun part about this is if you paint a really fun colored background, it's more fun to add less paint or press down and create those textures so you can see what's showing through underneath. Because even that is really beautiful, and I might leave it just like that.
It reminds me of a tie-dye shirt in like the best way.
Yeah. Alright. I think I'm going to leave it at that, and then I'll add the greenery on top of that. Okay, maybe I'll add some dark browns over here because it does get really dark back here. So I'll make that brown again with my green umber and madder lake. Maybe add a little bit more green in there so I have more of a green base. Greenish brown. I don't want to cover up too much of that really nice texture I got, so I'm trying to scrape it in pretty hard into the surface so I can scrape it into the canvas, but allowing some of what I put on there already to show through. All right. Now let's lay down some greenery. I don't want to lay down a solid chunk of green. I want more of a textured area of green. So I think this is a good place to use my wavy knife. So I have these greens. I pull them down. And I'll add this in with this. So I'm not completely covering what I put down, but I'm creating a nice organic green shape for my leaves to sit on top of. And I'm going for my darker greens first so I can get lighter. I'm just going to lock in some green. Definitely going to need to mix more paint, but this is a good start. And it goes right in front of the door here. So I'm going to be very careful with this one because it's very thin and viney here. And it goes in front of this nice little door decal. And I'm going to ask again because I never know the names of things, but I always want to call them by their names. Is there a name for this metal part on the door? Is it just like a fancy hinge? I feel like I need to know this. Got a little vine there. And there's a, oh god, again, trellis? Is that what it's called? A little ladder thing? Thank you. Okay. Yes. I did it. There's a little trellis in the background. I might kind of hint at it, but I'm not sure I'm loving the idea of having it in there. It's very dark in that area, and I'm already excited about all these other little things I'm going to add in here. Now I know it's kind of hard to see this green on top of this dark browny area, but once I start adding the highlights in the greenery, you'll definitely start to see it pop out. And I'm just tapping this, allowing part of it to touch the canvas, some of it to touch the entire canvas. Trying to be more organic, because if I were to just tap it on there in one go and one angle, you're going to get the same repetition of lines. So I'm trying to make sure I twist my palette knife as I go, just touch the end of the palette knife, be as organic as I can when adding these on here. There's a little bit more on the door here. And I'm already getting a really nice, lovely, leafy texture with this. So once I add in a little bit more up here, I'll show you guys up close what these little marks are looking like. Okay. So can you see... Actually, can we go with the dynamic? Maybe you can see it better on that one. You can kind of see that they're creating little oval divots, and it's almost the perfect little leaf texture. I'm going to, now that I have all of those kind of laid out, anywhere I need a highlight on those specific little divots that I've created, I have this guy and this guy, which will create a perfect little spot for each of those divots. I'm actually hoping that those dry so I can keep that texture before I add on those highlights. Now I am going to use my little crowny guy here. Add a little bit more of that green, but a little bit different color, so I can get some variation in the background. This is going to be more of like my mid-tones. And this again is going to create a really nice leafy shape. I'm going to try and not press down all of these little prongs at once, but maybe just a corner as I go, so I can really control how many I'm putting down at once.
Michaela,
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yes.
Jackie is wondering if you could use the wavy palette knife specifically, but pretty much any of them with undiluted watercolor, like out of the tube, to get the same kind of effect.
You could. I will say that when you are using the liquid or the like thick watercolor, when it dries, it's going to get really flaky. So if you're using it like impasto, I would be very, very careful with what you're painting on and how thick your paint is. And I always say when you're adding color, even if it's just one thing, like I know this is all green, it's always good to have at least 3 different values of the same color. It's really going to add that dimension and allow some things to fall into the background and some things to go into the foreground, depending on the value you are using. I'm gonna get a few more in here. You can definitely see in this area when I put these on here. A little bit more up here. I'm hoping that my first layer of leaves is starting to dry a little bit while I'm doing this. And another reason why having a lot of paint to work with is, for example, this palette knife, scraping a thin layer of paint onto each of these little prongs is going to be harder when you have a little bit. If you have a large pile of paint, it's going to be a lot easier to load this up and go. It's really full at the top, so I'm going to try and add quite a bit up here. Now, the reason I chose this reference photo is solely because of the shadows on the door, and I immediately was thinking, that's going to be so much fun to do with a palette knife. And again, my moderators, Amanda and Emmy, have those reference photos if you ever want to take a closer look at it. Alright. Again, making sure I clean this off before I grab my next one. Now I want to fix up some of my shapes down in my door, so I'm going to go for this guy. I love this guy. Now if we can go back up to the overhead, I'm going to use the same colors, and I have a lot of green in my blue. Get some more blue. I'm going to crisp up those shapes in my door before I go into my highlights. Because right now I'm loving the background, but I'm feeling the door doesn't quite fit yet. So I'm going to crisp up those shapes. Going into my smaller knives, and I love the texture that this guy gives. So I'm going to make sure everything I add with this guy is going in the same direction so I can be nice and consistent with my mark making. Especially with something like a door that's more man-made. It's going to have those really nice straight edges. I'm going to cover up some of my brown just so I can make sure I get that nice angle. I can always go back in. And I'm being a little bit more liberal with my paint. I want this to stand out now, and I'm not too worried about what I'm putting on next. And something fun with this is those lines that I'm getting, you can get really fun with it. I know you can't really see it right now, but I'm getting nice little streaks in my lines here in my wood. If you want, you can squiggle your palette knife as you go and get a really nice squiggly texture. I'm aiming for something a little bit more straight and man-made. But you can definitely get some really, really fun textures with this. This feels a little crooked, so I'm going to fix it up. And I'm not worried about this corner as much. I'm just going to put a flower on it, I think. Maybe put a little bit more in there. And these peaks that I've created are not dry yet, so I can move them around. I really just want to cover up more of that background. This I want to be a little bit more round. Alright, I'm feeling a little bit better about the door now. And make sure scrape off the excess paint and wipe it off. This one especially. I have already had some acrylic paint dry in those crevices. It's really easy to clean it out though if it does dry. Just make sure you bend it, allow those little prongs to separate, and clean it out. Now I think I'm ready for those absolutely fun highlights, those shadows on that door. And I was thinking about using this oval palette knife because it has a really lovely round edge. I can get a nice variety of shapes with this. And I'm just going to use white. Maybe I'll mix it in with my blue just so it's not too stark. So I'll grab some of my white and find those little spots of color. I'm probably going to do the big chunks with this, and then I'll go in with a smaller palette knife to get those tiny little spots. Maybe even my wavy one to repeat the pattern of my leaves into those highlights and shadows. Now I want to keep the separation of my little slats of wood, so I'm trying to add these section by section. And I'm really just squinting my eyes at my reference photo and finding those big blocks of color and allowing myself to lay those down. Even little taps. I was watching this one artist that works solely with palette knives, and the way he works is just so entertaining. He will stand back, put a quick dot, and stand and jump back again to look at what he did, and he just keeps doing that over and over again, and it's just the most satisfying palette knife painting to ever watch. He's so much fun. I will look up his name if you guys are interested. Let me know. Alright, I'm going to go back in with my wavy palette knife so I can repeat the pattern of my leaves into those highlights. So again, just the white. I'm going to mix that white into the blue I already have so it's not stark white. Making sure it's not too loaded up, and when I say that, when you look at it and you see clumps of paint between those crevices, that means it's going to be too much paint. And just tapping this in where there's some breaks in these highlights. And it's kind of distorted where it kind of stretches this way. So I'm allowing my brush, when I'm adding these, to go in the same direction or the same angle. There's a few up here, so I'm just going to use the nice little tip of this palette knife, which I love because it's almost perfectly rounded. You could stamp almost a full circle into a spot, which I actually did. For these little guys, I just used the circle end of my palette knife and stamped those perfect little circles on there. Alright, got a couple more up here, especially over on the edge. Just tap those in. Make sure I get to the edge of the door. That's really going to help make it look like a highlight and shadow. And I gotta make sure I get around this handle here. There's some behind the handle a little bit. Alright. So I feel like that's looking like the highlight, those shadows poking through. Now typically with shadows like this, I do think adding the shadows on top of the highlight is going to make it feel more of that realistic shadow on top of the highlight. I just thought it was going to be so much fun because of the shapes that you're getting with the highlight. Now let's go ahead and fix up my door shapes. I love this guy so much. He's so fun for details. So let's go ahead and add some of those back in. We have a nice door knocker here, and I lost the knocker part. So let's go ahead and put that back in there. I'm going to round out the bottom as well. And then I want to make this mail slot a little bit more rectangular because I used a round palette knife for that one. So again, I'm going to stamp that edge, load up the other side of my palette knife and stamp the bottom edge, create a nice little rectangle shape. Alright, and maybe I'll fix up my handle as well while I have this color on my knife. Got a nice little dot for the lock. Alright. Now I also have this light poking through the leaves on my brick here too. So I'm going to make a lighter color for my brick and add some of those highlights on there as well. Now I think I'm just going to grab a nice big chunk of white and that brilliant yellow deep and add it to the color I already have over here that I mixed for the background. And I could definitely just use that light yellow mixed with white and add it on there. I could have also just used straight white to add those highlights on the door, but I really think in order to help it feel like they're connected, mixing it with a little bit of the color that it should be in darkness is really going to help those colors harmonize together. So I'm just going to, again, squint my eyes, find those little highlights, and pop them in there. And there's some kind of poking through in the greenery, so I'll do a few of those over here as well. And I'm really just using the tip, so I'm just going to load up just the tip of the palette knife. And then there's a tiny little highlight on the ledge here. I'm just going to try and get that as well. Alright. Now I think, no, the greenery's not quite dry yet, but I am going to start going in with the highlights on my leaves. And I think I was using the squiggle and the crown, so I'm going to make sure I use those again when I'm adding in those highlights so I can keep that texture. If I have a very specific leaf I want to make sure I get to, I have these nice oval palette knives if I want to lay down just a single leaf somewhere. But let's go ahead and mix up some color. And of course, we all know that these are great for mixing colors. So I'm just going to use my big trowel here and mix a nice light green. I really like this yellowish green mixed with the green umber. You have a question?
More of a request.
Okay.
You're discussing how big palette knives can get. And I feel like you know what I'm going to ask.
Yes. If you are working on something bigger than this and you need to go real big, they can get pretty big. This is bigger than almost my palette. If you need to cover a really, really large space, or even just this whole panel in one swipe, you really could. But there truly is a palette knife for whatever you need. Thank you. I almost forgot about him. Okay. So I have my nice light green mixed up. I might go even a shade lighter for this, for those really highlight, like really high highlights. So let's go ahead using the same technique, making sure I'm not too loaded up on that paint, and add in those bright areas of greenery. And I'm focusing on just the bright areas. I'm kind of allowing myself to cover up what I put on there. It does definitely create more layering and texture in there. And like I said, I have these perfect oval tools if I want to highlight just a single leaf that's already in there. I love the texture I've already created. And if I create a line like I've done here, I'm going to try and break it up so it doesn't look like a solid line there. Make it feel a little bit more organic. And it's really nice once you have a dried layer of paint on here that already has texture. Adding more texture onto this is going to create a different experience while you're painting. Because instead of scraping it onto something flat, it's now going to start catching those high peaks of paint and create something a little bit different. It's really bright in this area, so I'm going to try and add quite a bit of this nice bright green in here. And you can kind of see it's already picking up those high points that I've created. And there is a vine over here, and since it is kind of straight and thin, but not like as straight as the door, I'm gonna go for this guy, where it has a nice long flat edge so I can get a nice long straight line, but it's also curved, so it's not going to be nice straight stark lines. I can get something a little bit more organic. So I'm just going to add paint just to the edge of my palette knife. And I'm hoping I can stamp my little vines into my doorway. And I have another one over here, might as well add that. Alright, now let's go ahead and add those really bright leaves, and then we'll end off with those flowers. Oh my goodness, it is 6:30. Alright, maybe we'll just jump into flowers. Panic painting. Alright, let's add some flowers. Okay, I did want to use my nice oval palette knife. I was totally in the zone. I didn't even realize. Okay, And I did want to create a nice marbling effect for these flowers. So I am going to add my Madder Lake and my white, and I'm not really going to mix it. I'm just going to grab them both on my knife. So it looks kind of like that. And I'm hoping it creates a nice little multicolored flower. Hey, look at that. Hey, it's a flower. And I can add these anywhere and everywhere I want. Trying to keep it nice and round. And they are mostly white. So as I need to load up my palette knife, I'm just grabbing more of that white and just tapping these on there. Are there any final questions while I add in these flowers? Can't believe we are done.
It looks incredible.
Thank you.
I don't have any questions currently, but a lot of viewers on Facebook have been inspired to break out the palette knives that they've bought and not explored.
Yay!
Yes.
I always love that. If you do, definitely share with us on our Facebook page, Jerry's Live Facebook page. And if you are not a part of that yet, make sure you answer that one security question so that you can get in. All right. How many flowers is enough flowers? I feel like I need a lot. Okay, we'll call that good. Thank you so much for joining me. I can't believe how fast that went. If you do try some palette knife painting, please share. We always love seeing that. You can add the class code, #JL349, so that we can see it, knowing where it comes from. But thank you so much for joining us, and I'm really excited to see you guys next week. I will not be here, but Emmy will, and she is going to be showing you how to draw lips with charcoal. So definitely come check that out. All right, let's go ahead and sign off. Thank you guys for coming. Bye!